We're at a point where the very food and school lunches that we feed our children, right, are causing what Jonathan Colesville says, death at an early age. So I call all of these things eco-apartheid. Now, I call it eco-apartheid because many of these things are not only happening in their schools, they're happening in our communities, and there are racial, gender, and socioeconomic dimensions to this. The whole term eco-apartheid was started by Van Jones. According to Van Jones, eco-apartheid is a situation where the benefits of the green economy bypass communities of color. So, for Van Jones, eco-apartheid was something that would happen in the future. But for me, eco-apartheid is something that's happening now, and it's something that has been happening, right? It has a long past. There's a continuum, a past, present, and potential future continuum. If I can't help motivate folks, and we can't work together to change these things. So, and eco-apartheid is greater than the green economy. So in my most recent article called Eco-Apartheid, Linking Environmental Health Outcomes to Educational, or Linking Environmental Health to Educational Outcomes, published by the Teachers College Record at Columbia University, 2011. I turn eco-apartheid into a systems theory that examines the ecological impacts of structural racialization. That is, it highlights the ways that structures, institutions have cumulatively caused and produce unequal environmental health outcomes and other benefits and burdens based on race, class, gender, language, immigration status, as well as their interconnections. So what do I mean by this term cumulative causation? How many grocery stores are there in West Oakland? People from the Bay Area do not answer this. Just take a guess. How many grocery stores are there in West Oakland? Come on, people.
100.
100. Good guess.
15.
15. Lower.
30.
5.
Lower than 5.
Oh my gosh.
Right. Right. Exactly. So you're getting the point, right? So in the community of West Oakland, depending on how you draw the boundaries, right, there's actually one grocery store, right? And they're doing really great work, the People's Grocery. Okay? They're doing phenomenal work. I actually had the pleasure of speaking at Pioneers with Van Jones and Nikki, who's the ED of People's Grocery. They're doing amazing work. But now, how many liquor stores are there in West Oakland?
200.
Right, a little lower, depending on how you draw the boundaries, between, let's call it between 60 and 75. Okay, depending on how you draw the boundaries. Now, come with me on this journey. Go inside, come into your eco-imagination, and you're going to hear me use this term. And you are a child who lives within those boundaries of West Oakland. All right, you can do it for your own community, or you can come with me on the West Oakland trip. Remember, we're talking about cumulative causation here, right? So, you're a young child, and you're hungry, and you're on your way to school, so you stop at the liquor store. Right? And what's available for you to eat in the liquor store?
Potato chips. Cheetos.
Chips, Cheetos, right? We got, right? Cheetos, chips, junk food, right? Period. So you load up on what's available to you, right? That's your neighborhood. That's your community. That's where you live. That's what's available to you, right? We haven't even gotten into the transportation issues, right? So this is what's available to you. All right, so you load up on chips, you go to school. You walk into the classroom. What are the race and the gender of the majority of teachers in urban public schools? Or rural, to be honest with you, but let's stick with urban for a minute.
White females.
White females. Fantastic, white females, right? That's good. However, remember, you're students of color right now. You're living in West Oakland. So now you've loaded up on your chips and your Cheetos and your candy. And now you go into the classroom and you sit down and you're all sugared up. And you're moving, right? You're active, right? Now, what is the diagnosis generally for that child in that situation? That's right. You said it, I didn't. Right? You said it, I didn't. That's what we mean by cumulative causation. Right? That's why eco-apartheid is so important. Right? Because it's looking at the cumulative effects of all of these racial and social toxins that are polluting our communities. Right? Instead of looking at them just one at a time. You've got to look at them collectively. Right? Why is this important, Akom? So what? Who cares? So the significance of redefining eco-apartheid is threefold. First, eco-apartheid suggests that environmental bads like toxic waste are in communities of color, while environmental goods such as Albertsons, the good Albertsons, right? Because you know there's good Albertsons and not so good Albertsons, right? So the good Albertsons, right, Whole Foods, if you're familiar with them, open space or parks are located in wealthier neighborhoods, right? Am I right or wrong?
Right.
We're right on so far, right? We're all together. Eco-apartheid is a more powerful definition than environmental racism, precisely because it captures inequalities beyond race, including space, place, and waste. For example, the urban grocery gap, which we just briefly touched upon, or the fresh produce gap, or the transportation gap, while simultaneously centering race, racism, and their political implications. This is one of the take-homes. From now on, I'm hoping everyone's going to use the term eco-apartheid instead of environmental racism, right, for the reasons that I'm sharing. Whenever someone talks, there should be some take-home, right, something that you really say, you know what, that makes sense to me. I'm going to use that, right? Third, eco-apartheid captures the political, historical, and spatial dimensions to the reproduction of racial and gender inequality. That is, the history of the United States, and this is in the words of Tim Wise. Okay, I'm summing up Tim Wise and Joy DeGury somewhat. Right? So the history of the United States is the history of systematic, institutionalized racial privilege for white people. And this is generally where white people start to sink down in their seats. They're like, oh man, he's calling me out. And white-looking people. That's the part where white people are like, oh wait, I haven't heard that one. So the history of the United States is the history of systematic, institutionalized racial privilege for white people and white-looking people, right? And I'm airing sort of folks of color's dirty laundry, right? Like, we know that black folks have a problem with dark skin, right? Many, not all, right? But in our own communities, we know that Latinos, Hispanics, whatever the term is in this part of the country, have problems with folks who got hair like mine and are my skin color. We know this to be true, right? We're airing our own dirty laundry, right? And we know that goes across the board for Asian folks, indigenous, it keeps going, right? That part of colonization and conquest was us losing that love for the deep, dark chocolate person and all that comes with that, right? That's just real talk, right? So we have, in our own communities, we have our own work to do, right? This isn't only about, hey, white folks versus what's happening with us. Although, white folks have to be held accountable because y'all started a lot of this and you need to clean it up, right? Like racism was not necessarily a person of color issue, right? We didn't really create that, right? So don't foist that upon me and then make me do the work to clean it up. White folks, get involved. Clean it up. This is your issue. You're benefiting from it, right? And we're going to talk about that. So my point is, this is not to blame white folks, right? It's rather to understand the role that whiteness has played in U.S. history, even if you are not white, right? America's pathology around race is our denial of it, right? That is what keeps us sick. That's what makes us continue to have this conversation over and over again, is that we actually deny oftentimes that we have a race problem. White folks do it, and so do folks of color. Even though they know they can't go home and have a conversation with their grandma about X, Y, Z. Right? So, without truth, we cannot grow and advance, right, as human beings. Because truth is the foundation of the human spirit, and it's the foundation of integrity. So when we don't tell the truth, and this is key, when we lie to others, or when we lie to ourselves, we collectively become sick. Right? And that's part of what's going down with us. We're all a little not as healthy as we should be. Because a lot of us live in denial. Right? So, the truth is that many people of color, we love ourselves. Always have. But we've had to pass, remember passing, right, in order to access scarce institutional resources and privileges. Right? So there were folks who loved their dark skin, loved their curly hair, but they had to pass a brown bag test in order to be able to get access to a better neighborhood, a better swimming pool, a better life. Right? And those things have been passed on from one generation to the next. Right? That's part of the truth. The other part of the truth is that the history of the United States is the history of systematic institutionalized racial privilege for white people or white-looking people. Whether you're talking about the Naturalization Act of 1790, right? This is in the words of Tim Wise, the first law passed by Congress after the Constitution was ratified, which said whites and whites only could be free citizens of the United States. Or whether you're talking about the Homestead Act of 1862, which guaranteed whites 160 acres of land, 160 acres for $10. Okay, 160 acres, that's a lot for $10, right? When black folks / people of color, we couldn't even get 40 acres and a mule, right? Or whether you're talking about federally subsidized, federally underwritten FHA and VHA loans, on the backs of those loans was the creation of the white middle class. And if you would have done the same thing for folks of color, you call it, when you do the same thing for folks of color, you call it welfare. But if you do it for white folks, you call it good, sound economic policy. Right? That's just real. That's real talk. So that's the truth. That's our history. We got to deal with that before we can move forward. Right? Or we could just lie to ourselves and move backwards. Right? There is no such thing as staying the same. You're either getting better or you're getting worse. Right? You're not just staying the same. We haven't perfected that. So it's not just about wealth, right? But it's also about health. Right? We know the stuff about wealth. A great book is Oliver and Shapiro, Black Wealth, White Wealth, or American Apartheid by Massey, and I could go on and on. Right? But what about health? What about life expectancy? Right? What about healthy schools and sick schools? Whole regions that are winner regions and loser regions. Right? So we're going to see what eco-apartheid looks like in the Bay Area. So this is a toxic release inventory map. The red dots are basically where smokestacks are located. The gray areas are essentially where folks of color live, right? Such that black folks are 3 times more likely to live next to a TRI facility. Latinos are 2 times more likely, and Asian folks, and we got to disaggregate that, are 1.5 times more likely to live next to a TRI facility. And this is the life expectancy gap. What you see here is that, I'm just going to sum this up because there's actually a lot in this, but I don't have the time to really break it down. So essentially, if you live in the Berkeley Hills, like I do, right, I am going to live 10.1 years longer than if I lived in the Oakland Flatlands. 10 years. That's a pretty good deal, isn't it? It's a pretty good deal. Or if you live in Bayview, Hunters Point, you're going to live 14.1 years less, right, than if you lived in Russian Hill in San Francisco. Now that's a messed up deal, right? There should you should start to feel some fire about that deal, right? Because these are real lives that we're talking about, real people that we're talking about. And 14.1 years is priceless, and everybody in this room knows it, right? You give doggone near an arm and a leg for those 14.1 years, literally, right? What about achievement? So, in that article, I introduced a term called academic apartheid, but we're familiar with the academic forms of apartheid. Shortage of qualified teachers, inadequate instructional material, overcrowded facilities, lack of access to AP courses, underrepresentation in California, it would be in the California State University system or the UC system, overrepresentation in terms of suspension and dropouts. That's academic apartheid, right? But eco-apartheid is the overburden of toxic emissions, the lack of access to adequate health care, the urban grocery gap, as I've named, lack of access to fresh produce. We're talking about food deserts versus food oases, right? And the hyper-concentration of schools next to landfills, incinerators, and polluting industries. So we have not correctly identified the problem. We do not have an achievement gap. We have an opportunity gap. That's your second take home. If you weren't already using this term. Many of you are already familiar with this. But if you weren't, no longer use achievement gap. Why? Because the achievement gap implies inequalities based on cultural or genetic differences. Right? Whereas the opportunity gap remaps inequalities onto existing structural conditions. So if we see it as an opportunity gap, then we must ask ourselves, what is happening to those who don't get in? Now, as all of you know, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but we house 20% of the world's prisoners.